your brain some glucose, because I know this is very thought-provoking. Does anyone have any questions, or does anyone want to expand on any of the topics that were presented? I know, Dr. Hyatt, you said you had some thoughts.
Okay, so Vic, very good summary of the history and the subject matter. I was there, I remember, and I think the thing that I've been curious about more recently in my work is the life course history. And if we're really going to have some lasting impact on inequities, do we do that with adults, or do we focus our attention earlier in life and on childhood education and environmental exposures? So I think the answer to that may be yes, but it means that the time that it takes to really affect inequities in the population may be a lot longer than we have patience for. So, or that we can, not patience for, maybe that's the wrong word, but that we have time for in our how do you focus on a cohort and change over time? So there must be ways of doing that, having effects on childhood development, focused on their eventual manifestation in adulthood. I was hoping that would be a topic that we could explore a little bit.
Okay, yes. When I looked at the title, it looked obvious. The response looked obvious in the sense that why hasn't epidemiologic data eliminated health disparities? But the answer might be because what is upon the people is somehow reduced to individual factors, and then we overemphasize what is called the risk factors. Because fundamentally, if epidemiology is about what is upon people, we lose what is upon the health disparities. People without insurance, how do you blame them? Tobacco smoking, when really the fundamental problem is maybe taxation, maybe in ideal setting, completely eliminating tobacco from society. But then we end up reducing it at the individual, stop smoking, and then we also reduce it in the sense of individual education, when somehow the individual has no control, has no capacity to actually stop that kind of behavior. How do we stop childhood obesity, when in reality it is linked to neighborhood violence because they can't get out? And then somehow we also lose sight of history. We know John Snow persuaded the health authorities not because he knew that there was the bacteria in the water, but he was convinced, based on what he had seen, that probably he can take action in the face of uncertainties. And I think that over time we are also missing that. We know we talk of social determinant of health, but that is somehow becomes more abstraction instead of translating those determinants into reality that the individual has no control. In the end, what we end up doing is still focusing on the risk. So to come back to the question of why hasn't epidemiologic data eliminated is because we are missing some critical elements and we just focus on individuals. That's all. That's what I was saying. And Victor actually mentioned reductionism, which is in part true. And that's what we end up doing. And part of the answer is that it's more easier, more politically correct than to tackle the most contextual issues that is upon the population. I hope I'm making sense.
So if the whole world thought like us, the whole world could use data and make decisions, if everybody used evidence-based data, then there would be no disparities. We know perfectly well to get rid of a lot of disparities, we need a single payer, so everybody's insured. That makes sense to us. But the problem is that not everybody thinks like us. There's differences in power, in fear, in greed, in empathy, and all these things are playing into a lot of the public and a lot of decision makers. So I think one of Vic's desires is that epidemiology focus on, so we know what we can do to decrease disparities, we know that. How can we get other people to take our perspective? And how do we do that? We have to figure out why greed drives things, why people are afraid, why people don't have empathy, why they're selfish, and how those things influence decision making.
To answer your one question, why did anybody believe that by producing all this data, it would make this big impact? The reason is we wanted to believe it. That's what we wanted to believe. I mean, we had committed our lives to producing information with the idea that it would change behavior, it would change the way people thought. We believed it because we want to believe it. And I think fundamentally, that's what happens. My third or fourth day at managing minority HIV programs for the Centers for Disease Control, there was a guy standing outside my office, a guy named Dick Gregory, who was a comedian, and he said AIDS was a conspiracy to exterminate black people. And I thought, well, that's stupid. No black person would believe something that stupid. I was wrong. People believe what they want to believe. And I think that what we can do is get people to think a little bit better, but fundamentally, what we have to understand, I think, and this is a very bad way of thinking about it, but the fact of the matter is, Homo sapiens were scavengers on the plains of Africa for the first 50,000 years. You know, scavengers are not known for cooperation. You know, it is in our nature. I'm not sure that it's in our nature to be cooperative and kind. But at the same time, I think that what forces us to do something is conflict. And I'm not sure the conflict is in and of itself bad. It's how we handle the conflict. So in the last month and a half, 2, 3, 4 months, I've been thinking about the mistakes that we made. And one of them is race. I will no longer use that word to refer to human beings because people use the word race because they're afraid to say the word racism. Most people, black and white in this country, are afraid to say racism, scared to death because they think some Confederate is going to come down and hit them on the head or something. You know, and if we can encourage students not to say the word race, it will do two things. Number one, it will force them to think, well, if it's not race, what is it? One of those things is it's racism, you know, and racism is not simple, and it's not just something to blame white people for, because there's all kinds of racism. It's far more complex than that. And the second thing, it forces us to think about how these differences occur. People, we have ethnicity. My family has been in this country since the 1640s. And yet I've still had people come up and say, so where are you from? You know, it's crazy, but that's the way people think, you know. Mexican Americans have been in Texas for 5,000 years. European came in 1870, and all of a sudden Mexican Americans are immigrants? Are you kidding me? This is insane. But this is what people do. And I think what we have to do is go back, in my opinion, to some fundamental questions. If it's not race, then what is it? It's ethnicity. In my view, it's not the complete answer, but it seems to me very important to understand people's history, culture, and shared values. And in spite of everything that's taught in this country, African Americans actually have history, and they actually have culture, and they actually have shared values. But even most African Americans don't understand that they have history, culture, and shared values. Let me give you an example and then I'll stop. Are there any persons of Jewish or Irish ethnic? What island did most people of North Heritage land on in this country? Well, what? Yeah, Ellis Island. Even a black person knows that. But if you ask a black person what island did 80% of the black Americans had an ancestor to land on, how many black people could say what that island is? 80% of us have an ancestor. Not recent, but 80% of us have an ancestor to land on one small part of one small island. And the vast majority of African Americans can't even tell you that. And it's Sullivan's Island for the answers. It's a Pescat's where the slave ship, after the initial thing in Virginia, then moved to South Carolina, slaves landed on this island in Best Colony, and then it was shipped out to Mississippi and Alabama and other things. Fundamentally. But the fact of the matter is, most African Americans know very little about African Americans. That's unfortunately a reality. My work is focused on African Americans, but this is also true in other ethnic groups. So it always amazes me that Mexican Americans talk about being immigrants. It's the Confederates who were the immigrants into Texas in the 1850s. That's what happened. So, I think we need to. The main thing I'm getting to is we need a generation of young people who could rethink the mistakes that we made in 1991. We need young people who could think outside the box, come up with different questions that we need answers. And I know that there's some, but I don't know all of them. And that's what I'm hoping for, a generation of young people who can think outside the box.
Bertha's the moderator.
I think we'll take two last comments,
So, a couple of quick thoughts, and I think in terms of the question about focusing on young people, versus older people, sure, in many ways we probably could identify more or lead to more successes in that way, but it seems like that in itself would be a kind of a miscarriage of justice in a sense that, that groups who had to deal with a longer history of particular types of injustices, sort of warrant the attention as well, but it's a thought. But my thoughts as to why we haven't gotten to more success in terms of disparities is that I think that generally large-scale interventions are rarely focused on the disparate groups. And so, just as a different kind of an example, you talked about literacy. A large-scale intervention to address literacy in this country was Sesame Street, but it ended up benefiting middle-class people more than poor people, because everybody could watch Sesame Street, and it's a wonderful kind of intervention, societal level intervention, but it wasn't necessarily targeted to the people who need it most. And then I think even when they do target things on the groups who need it most, I don't think there's enough attention to syndemics. And so we might address smoking in a particular group, but then they might live in a very poor food environment and they gain more weight, and because we haven't really addressed the broader, particularly for groups who are experiencing poverty on top of traumatic histories, on top of any number, on top of racism. And then I guess my last question for you, I would really like if you could go back to the slide where it showed where we've seen successes and failures, and I know it was kind of even in terms of the 2020 goals on racial and ethnic disparities. But I do that one. But I do wonder if there's anything we could learn from the successes. Like, is there a pattern? And